You want to know one of my biggest pet peeves? It's when people say negotiation is about finding a middle ground. I hate that. It is true. Compromise is a part of negotiation. But here's the thing. It's not the biggest part. It's not the most important part. It's not the funnest part. And it's definitely not what makes a negotiator great. So, if you are someone who thinks negotiation is about finding a middle ground or finding a compromise or splitting the difference, I want to say this is part of the problem. And in fact, if you have ever had a so-called solution that has felt dissatisfying or less effective, chances are it is a middle ground problem. In the comments section, tell me your own stories of finding a middle ground that left you feeling less than satisfied. And if you never want to have a situation like that again, keep on watching. I'm Bob Bordone. I'm a senior fellow at Harvard Law School. I'm the founder and former director of Harvard Law School's Negotiation and Mediation clinical program. I taught negotiation, conflict resolution, mediation, and many other courses at Harvard Law School for more than 2 decades, and I'm a founder and principal of the Cambridge Negotiation Institute. So today, I'm going to tell you about the problem of middle ground compromises, and importantly, I'm going to give you some tools to avoid them going forward. Problem number 1, as I suggested, is that a middle ground compromise often doesn't really satisfy anyone, meaning that people will end up with some kind of a solution, except it's not a solution grounded in what's actually important to them. Let me share with you a historical example, because even sophisticated negotiators can get stuck in middle ground negotiations. So let's go back to the late 1970s. When the United States was helping Egypt and Israel mediate a peace in the Camp David Accords. One of the major challenges was how to deal with the Sinai Peninsula. The Sinai Peninsula was occupied by Israel, and Egypt wanted it back. And the American negotiators kept on finding middle grounds, meaning they kept on drawing boundary lines of the Sinai where the Israelis would withdraw and then the rest would go back to Egypt. And both sides consistently said no, 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 no. So one way of looking at this is that both sides were stubborn. But I actually think the problem was that the Americans were searching for a middle ground compromise. I'm going to share with you how this problem got solved. But first, I want to tell you about another problem of middle ground compromises, is that they often leave value on the table. So let me give you just the classic example of why a middle ground solution leaves value on the table. So this is a story of 2 sisters. They are fighting over the last orange in the house, and the conflict is escalating. And so at some point, a somewhat disgruntled mom intervenes, and she cuts the orange in half. And each sister takes her half, and good things follow because the sisters stop fighting. And it's based on a principle of equity, and you're probably thinking like, this is an example of middle ground working. What happens next is one sister takes her half and she peels it and she eats the fruit and throws the peel away. And you're sitting there thinking, what's wrong with this? But then what happens next is the other sister takes her half and she peels it and she throws the fruit away. And she uses the peel for the zest in a cake she's baking. An example of a middle ground compromise that completely cuts the value of what each party wanted in half. Because one sister wanted the fruit, and the other sister wanted the peel. The middle ground actually cut the value in half for both of them. Truth of the matter is that there is another way of addressing all of this in negotiation that has nothing to do with middle ground compromises. So what to do instead? Instead of thinking about middle grounds, which are often based on parties' positions, what I want you to do is think about underlying interests. So what do I mean by this? Well, whenever someone says something like, I would like an office with a window, or I would like $1 million, or I would like to be president of the United States, or I would like the orange, That is the position. That's the thing that they say that they want. Right behind all of those positions is the why driving that position. And the answer to the why is what we mean by the interest. So let's go back to our example of the orange. The position, I want the orange. The interest is, I'm hungry, I want to eat fruit. The interest is, I'm baking a cake and need that peel. Let's go back to the Israeli-Egyptian example of the Sinai. The position of each side was, we want the Sinai, no, we want the Sinai. But it wasn't until there was impasse. Roger Fisher was the founder of the Harvard Negotiation Project. He was one of my mentors. So if you want to learn more about how great a negotiator Roger was, watch my video about him. So what happens is Roger gets involved, and there is this moment where the Israeli Prime Minister, Menachem Begin, basically says to Roger, here's the problem. One thing that we cannot compromise on is Israeli security. And then Sadat responds and says, well, you know what? One thing we cannot compromise is Egyptian sovereignty. Aha! The interests are sovereignty and security. And so Roger asks each of these leaders to elaborate. And what he learns from the Egyptian prime minister was, at the time, it took the Israeli army 4 hours to mobilize. And so he basically said, we cannot have Egyptian army personnel, military, tanks within 4 hours of traveling time to the Israeli border. Thank you very much, says Roger. President Sadat, what do you mean by security? President Sadat tells a long story about how through all of human history, the Sinai has been Egyptian, and at various times people have marauded it, but it's basically historically Egyptian land. Very much. What Roger then tells the Americans is, draw me a line of tank traveling time that is 4 hours from the Israeli border into the Sinai. And they do this and they draw a line there. And then Roger says, from this point to the border of Israel, it's a demilitarized zone. No Egyptian tanks, no Egyptian military personnel, but it belongs to Egypt. In fact, all the resources are Egyptian. You could put Egyptian flags everywhere you want. They control the police, they control the schools, they control the education. And then from the point beyond 4 hours, it is completely Egyptian and not demilitarized. Problem solved. Why was that a middle ground? Absolutely not. The interests were security and sovereignty. The only way to solve the problem was actually meeting the underlying interests, not simply finding a middle ground. And in fact, almost all negotiations that get stuck around middle grounds or that reach middle grounds are missing finding ways to meet the underlying interests. Because in fact, most of the time, there isn't a real middle ground around an underlying interest. If my interest is security, I'm not going to settle at 43% secure. If my interest is sovereignty, I'm not going to settle at 53% sovereignty. But once we get at those interests, there's all sorts of creative things that we can do. And that leads to the next step here, right? When we go from positions to interests, we have an opportunity to brainstorm a whole bunch of creative outcomes that usually take a single issue negotiation and make it multi-issue. And when we have a multi-issue negotiation, middle grounds fade away because we have all sorts of ways of meeting interests, being creative, and making trades. Last thing I want to say about the brilliance of moving from positions to interests is it opens up a human and relational element that is always in negotiation, but often gets missed. What I call intangible interests. So what is an intangible interest? Well, if you're negotiating with a person on the other side, they probably have an interest in feeling heard and feeling valued and feeling respected. And we know that real people will make real decisions based on whether those interests are actually met. And in fact, sometimes what's most important is that intangible interest being met. Research has shown that the number one reason why people change jobs is not around the pay or the benefits. It's because they don't feel seen, valued, appreciated, or respected. When we get stuck on middle grounds, we often end up with unhappy compromises when we move from positions to interests, we actually expand the range of outcomes that actually can make sure that both sides feel satisfied and understood. So for more about being effective in negotiation and influence, watch my next video, The Art of Persuasion. Also, before you leave, don't forget to subscribe to my channel, like this video, and ring the bell so you keep on getting great new material to apply in your personal and professional life. Okay, it's not difficult to keep watching. Click, click.